Hey guys, tonight we are making history. The treasury is empty and the king needs gold. We are stepping into the royal mint, where the fire is hot and the silver is flowing. We are going to watch raw metal turn into the coins that built empires. This is a story about wealth, precision, and the sound of money. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, listen to the furnace roar, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The workshop sits deep within the castle walls, protected by stone so thick that even the loudest clang of hammer on anvil becomes a muffled whisper by the time it reaches the courtyard outside. This is not a place for casual visitors. This is not a place where merchants wander in to check the progress of their commissioned pieces. This is the Royal Mint, and it operates under guard, under lock, under the direct authority of the crown itself. The walls here are not decorative. They are fortress walls, built from blocks of limestone that were quarried from the hills to the north and hauled here by cart and oxen, each stone cut to fit so precisely that you could not slide a blade between them. The ceiling vaults overhead, supported by thick wooden beams that have darkened with age and smoke until they are nearly black. These beams creak sometimes, when the heat from the furnaces rises and makes the wood expand, and that creaking is a constant companion to the work that happens here, a reminder that even stone and timber must yield to the relentless presence of fire. The door to this workshop is oak, reinforced with iron bands that run horizontally across its face in thick straps, and it is watched, always watched. Two guards stand on either side, men-at-arms in the king's livery, wearing chainmail that catches the torchlight and throws it back in tiny glints of silver. They do not smile. They do not chat with passers-by. They stand with halberds in hand, and their eyes track every movement in the corridor beyond. No one enters without authorization. No one leaves without inspection. Because what happens behind this door is the transformation of raw wealth into the lifeblood of the kingdom's economy, and every ounce of silver that passes through must be accounted for. The master of the mint keeps ledgers, thick books bound in leather where every bar of bullion is recorded, every coin struck is tallied, every scrap of waste metal is weighed and documented. The king's auditors come regularly, unannounced, to verify these numbers, and the penalties for discrepancy are severe. A moneyer who skims even a fraction of an ounce might find himself missing a hand, or worse. Inside, the heat greets you like a physical presence. It is not the gentle warmth of a hearth in a manor hall. It is the oppressive, suffocating heat of industry, of combustion, of metal being forced to change its very nature through the application of relentless temperature. The furnaces are built into the far wall, three of them in a row, each one constructed from fire brick that has been imported at considerable expense, because local clay cannot withstand the sustained temperatures required to melt silver. These furnaces glow. Even when they are banked low, conserving fuel during the night hours, they radiate heat in waves that you can feel from across the room. When they are roaring at full intensity, fed by the rhythmic pumping of the bellows, the air itself seems to shimmer and dance, distorted by thermal currents that rise toward the vaulted ceiling and pool there in a layer of superheated atmosphere that makes the roof timbers sweat sticky beads of resin. The smell is distinctive. Charcoal smoke, dense and almost sweet, mingles with the sharper tang of hot metal. There is sulfur in the air, too, a faint whiff of brimstone that comes from impurities in the silver being burned away, and underneath it all is the earthy scent of clay from the crucibles and the stone dust that settles on every surface, despite the best efforts of the apprentices who sweep the floor each evening. The workers here, the journeyman moneyers and their assistants, become so accustomed to this combination of scents that they no longer notice it. But a visitor, stepping through that heavy oak door for the first time, is immediately struck by the realization that this is a place where earth and fire collaborate to create something entirely new. The light in the workshop is uneven, a patchwork of shadow and brilliance. The furnaces provide most of the illumination, their open mouths glowing orange-white when the fires are stoked, throwing long shadows across the stone floor that shift and flicker with every movement of the flames. Oil lamps hang from iron hooks driven into the wooden beams, adding smaller pools of steadier light. But even these seem inadequate against the encompassing darkness that presses in from the corners of the room. The workers move through this landscape of light and shadow like figures in a dream, their faces lit from below by the forge glow, their features cast into stark relief, eyes bright and watchful, skin sheened with sweat that reflects the firelight in streaks of amber. This is where it begins. This is where the transformation happens. This is where silver, the second most precious metal known to man, is taken from its raw, unworked state and shaped into the standardized discs that will carry the king's portrait and the mark of his authority into every corner of the realm. Each coin that emerges from this workshop is not merely a piece of metal. It is a token of trust, a promise that the crown guarantees its value, a physical manifestation of royal power that can be held in the hand, exchanged for goods, accumulated into wealth, or paid out as taxes. The minting of coins is therefore not simply a craft. It is a responsibility, a sacred duty performed under the watchful eyes of guards and auditors, where precision matters and deviation from the standard is intolerable. The silver arrives in the morning, usually. It comes under heavy guard, transported in iron-bound chests that take two strong men to lift, carried on wagons that roll through the castle gates and across the inner ward to the mint workshop. The master of the mint is always present to receive these shipments. He carries the keys to the chests on a ring that hangs from his belt, and he personally supervises the unloading, watching as each chest is lowered carefully to the cobblestones, and then carried inside through the oak door, past the guards, into the workshop where the real work will begin. The chests are set down on a heavy wooden table that stands near the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained from years of use, and then the master unlocks them, one by one, lifting the lids to reveal the contents within. The silver bullion sits there, gleaming dully in the lamplight. These are not the bright, polished bars you might imagine. This is raw silver, refined from ore but not yet worked into anything useful, and its surface has the matte, slightly granular appearance of metal that has been cast into rough ingots and then left to cool in the open air. Each bar is approximately the length of a man's forearm, perhaps 12 inches long, and about 2 inches wide and 1 inch thick. They are heavy, surprisingly heavy. Silver is a dense metal, denser than it appears, and when you pick up one of these bars, hefting it in your hand to test its weight, you can feel the solid mass of it, the way it seems to pull downward with an insistence that speaks to its fundamental nature as one of the Earth's treasures, something that had to be dug from deep underground, smelted in furnaces, not unlike the ones that burn against the far wall of this very workshop, and purified through processes that are as much alchemy as metallurgy. The color of unpolished silver is often a surprise to those who have only seen finished coins or jewelry. It is not the bright, mirror-like silver of a polished chalice or a noble's dinner plate. It is duller, grayer, with a slightly bluish cast that makes it look almost lead-like in certain lights. The surface is often marked with small imperfections, tiny pits and dimples where air bubbles were trapped during the casting process, and there may be faint lines or striations running along the length of the bar, evidence of the way the molten metal settled as it cooled in the mold. Some bars have numbers stamped into them, marks indicating their weight or their source, made with steel punches that leave sharp, clean impressions in the soft metal. Other bars bear the seal of the refiner, a small symbol that certifies the purity of the silver, guaranteeing that it meets the standard required for coinage. Handling these bars is a ritual in itself. The master of the mint does not simply grab them carelessly and toss them aside. Each bar is lifted carefully, inspected visually for obvious defects, and then set on a large bronze scale that stands on its own pedestal near the table. The scale is a precision instrument, balanced with lead weights that have been certified by the king's asher, and it can detect differences of less than a grain. Each bar is weighed individually, and the weight is called out by the master, while a scribe, seated at a smaller table nearby, records the number in the ledger with careful strokes of his quill pen. The ink is black and slightly thick, made from oak gall and iron sulfate, and it dries quickly on the vellum pages, leaving a permanent record that will be checked and cross-checked and verified by multiple officials before the silver is allowed to proceed to the next stage of transformation. The apprentices stand nearby, watching this process with the focused attention of young men who know that their future depends on learning every detail of the craft. They are not yet trusted to handle the silver themselves, not the valuable bullion at least, but they watch the master's hands, noting how he grips each bar firmly but without excessive force, how he sets it on the scale pan so that it sits level and does not shift, how he waits for the balance to settle completely before declaring the weight. They watch the scribe too, learning the proper format for the ledger entries, understanding that accuracy in record-keeping is just as important as accuracy in metalworking, because a kingdom's currency cannot be based on approximations or guesswork. Every ounce must be accounted for. Every fraction must be tracked. The numbers in the ledger are not mere bureaucratic notation. They are the foundation of trust that makes commerce possible. When all the bars have been weighed and recorded, they are stacked carefully on a shelf that runs along the wall near the furnaces, within easy reach of the work area, but safely away from the most intense heat. The shelf is iron, not wood, because wood would char and eventually catch fire from the constant radiant heat, and the bars sit there in neat rows, waiting their turn to be transformed. Sometimes, when the light catches them just right, you can see the faint sheen of the metal, a hint of the brightness that will emerge once the silver has been melted and worked and struck into coins. But for now, they are patient, inert, waiting for the fire to wake them. The crucibles are prepared next. These are not the simple clay parts you might use for cooking or storage. These are specialized vessels, carefully crafted from a specific type of clay that can withstand extreme temperature changes without cracking. The clay comes from a deposit far to the east, beyond the mountains, where the earth yields a gray-brown material that remains stable at temperatures high enough to melt silver. The crucible makers are a specialized guild unto themselves, and they guard their techniques jealously, passing knowledge from master to apprentice in carefully controlled apprenticeships that last for years. Each crucible is shaped by hand on a potter's wheel, formed into a deep, rounded pot with thick walls and a slightly flared rim. The walls must be thick enough to insulate the molten metal and prevent heat loss, but not so thick that they become unwieldy or prone to thermal stress. The rim must be smooth and even, so that when the crucible is lifted with tongs and tilted to pour, the metal flows out cleanly without catching on rough edges or spilling unpredictably. After the initial shaping, the crucibles are dried slowly, over the course of several days, in a controlled environment where the air circulation is carefully managed to prevent uneven drying that might introduce weak points. Then they are fired in a kiln, at temperatures lower than those they will eventually endure, but high enough to harden the clay and drive off any remaining moisture. The firing process gives the crucibles their characteristic gray color and makes them ring with a faint, bell-like tone when tapped with a knuckle. A crucible that produces a dull thud instead of a clear ring is rejected, because that dullness indicates a flaw in the structure, a crack or void that will almost certainly fail under the stress of containing molten silver. Each crucible is inspected carefully before use. The moneyer runs his hands over the exterior surface, feeling for rough spots or irregularities. He peers inside, checking for cracks or chips along the interior walls. He hefts it, testing its weight, making sure it feels solid and balanced. Only when he is satisfied does he set it aside as ready for service. Crucibles are valuable, and they can be reused multiple times if they are handled carefully and not subjected to thermal shock, but eventually they all fail. A crucible that has been used too many times becomes brittle, its walls thinned by erosion from the molten metal, its structure weakened by repeated heating and cooling cycles. When a crucible cracks during use, spilling molten silver across the floor, it is a disaster. The silver can be recovered and remelted, but the loss of productivity and the danger to the workers makes crucible failure something to be avoided at all costs. Now the real work begins. One of the journeyman moneyers selects a silver bar from the shelf, hefting it to confirm its weight, and carries it to the work table. He has done this thousands of times, and the movements are automatic now, practiced until they require no conscious thought. The bar is placed on an iron cutting plate, and using a heavy steel chisel and a mallet, he begins to break it into smaller pieces. The chisel is positioned carefully, aligned with one of the natural weak points where the crystalline structure of the cast metal makes it more prone to fracture, and then the mallet descends with a sharp, ringing blow. The silver doesn't cut cleanly like wood. It deforms slightly under the impact, the metal compressing and spreading before the chisel edge finally pushes through, and then there is a sharp crack as the bar separates into two pieces. The edges of the break are rough, showing the grainy interior structure of the metal, and these pieces will be further subdivided, broken again and again until they are small enough to fit into the crucible. The broken pieces of silver are collected in a shallow iron pan and carried to the furnace. The apprentice who tends this particular furnace has been stoking it for the past hour, feeding carefully measured amounts of charcoal into the firebox and pumping the bellows in a steady rhythm that keeps the temperature climbing steadily. The charcoal comes from a supplier who specializes in hardwood charcoal, oak and beech mainly, because these woods produce a fuel that burns hot and clean with minimal smoke and ash. The charcoal arrives in large sacks, and it is stored in a dry room to prevent it from absorbing moisture from the air, because damp charcoal produces excessive smoke and reduces the efficiency of the burn. The bellows are massive leather bags, reinforced with wooden frames, and they are operated by foot pedals that allow the apprentice to maintain a continuous flow of air into the furnace chamber without exhausting himself. The rhythm of the bellows becomes a kind of meditation, a steady pump that drives fresh oxygen into the fire, raising the temperature incrementally with each stroke. The apprentice watches the color of the flames, noting how they shift from orange to yellow to a brilliant white as the temperature increases, and he adjusts his pumping speed accordingly, increasing the airflow when the temperature begins to drop, easing off when it climbs too high. The crucible is brought forward, already preheated by sitting near the furnace opening for the past several minutes. If a cold crucible were suddenly filled with hot metal, the thermal shock would almost certainly crack it, so preheating is essential. The moneyer uses a long iron rod to nestle the crucible into a prepared depression in the bed of glowing coals, positioning it so that it sits level and stable. Then, piece by piece, he begins to add the silver. The broken chunks of metal are dropped into the crucible using tongs, each piece clanking against the clay interior with a dull metallic sound. The crucible gradually fills, the silver pieces stacking and jamming against each other in a chaotic pile that shows no hint yet of the transformation to come. When the crucible is about two-thirds full, the moneyer steps back and nods to the apprentice, who increases the rhythm of his bellows pumping. The fire responds immediately, the flames leaping higher, their color shifting toward white, and the heat intensifies to a point where it becomes uncomfortable to stand within several feet of the furnace opening. The moneyer watches through a small viewing port, a hole in the side of the furnace just large enough to see through, and he observes the silver as it begins to change. At first, nothing seems to happen. The silver pieces just sit there in the crucible, gray and solid, apparently unaffected by the heat that surrounds them. But the temperature is climbing, degree by degree, and the metal is absorbing energy, its molecules vibrating with increasing intensity, even though this internal change is not yet visible from the outside. Then, gradually, the surface of the silver begins to change color. The dull gray takes on a warmer cast, a faint brownish tint that spreads across the exposed surfaces like a stain. This is the beginning. The metal is approaching its melting point, and the first signs of transformation are appearing. The brown darkens to black as oxides form on the surface, and then suddenly, in the space of a few seconds, the black coating breaks apart and falls away, revealing metal that has begun to glow with its own internal light. The silver is cherry red now, the color of the coals that surround it, and it is starting to soften. The sharp edges of the broken pieces begin to round, the corners slumping as the metal loses its rigidity. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the pieces begin to merge. Where two chunks of silver touch, the boundary between them starts to blur, the solid metal flowing together like water, finding its own level, obeying the dictates of surface tension and gravity. The transformation accelerates. The pile of silver pieces in the crucible is no longer a pile. It is becoming a pool. The individual chunks lose their identity, flowing together into a single mass of glowing, incandescent metal. The color shifts again, from cherry red to orange, and the surface of the pool becomes mirror smooth, reflecting the flames that dance above it. This is molten silver, heated to approximately 962 degrees Celsius, and it has the appearance of liquid mercury, that same heavy, flowing quality, that same sense of contained power. But unlike mercury, this metal is intensely hot, radiating thermal energy in waves that make the air around the furnace shimmer and pulse. The moneyer continues to watch, checking the consistency of the melt. He is looking for complete liquefaction, making sure that every last piece of solid silver has dissolved into the pool, that there are no unmelted lumps lurking beneath the bright surface. He uses a long iron rod to stir the molten metal gently, swirling it in the crucible, and he observes how it flows. Good molten silver has a specific viscosity, a certain fluidity that comes from being at the correct temperature and from being properly purified. If the melt is too cool, it will be sluggish, thick, reluctant to flow. If it is too hot, it becomes dangerously thin and prone to splattering. The moneyer is aiming for a point just slightly above the melting temperature, hot enough to ensure complete liquidity, but not so hot that he risks damaging the crucible or wasting fuel. On the surface of the molten silver, a thin film of dross appears. This is the inevitable result of heating metal in the presence of air. Oxides and other impurities are drawn to the surface by density differences and by chemical reactions with the atmosphere, and they form a dark, scummy layer that floats on top of the bright metal below. This dross must be removed before the silver can be poured, because any impurities that make it into the final product will weaken the metal and alter its color and workability. The moneyer uses a shallow iron ladle to skim the dross from the surface, carefully dragging the ladle across the top of the melt and lifting away the contaminated material. The dross is deposited into a waste bowl, where it will cool and then be saved for later processing. Even this waste contains small amounts of silver, and in a mint where every ounce must be accounted for, nothing is truly discarded. The waste will be sent to the refiners, who will process it to recover whatever silver it contains, and those recovered fragments will eventually make their way back to the mint to be melted again. The skimming process is repeated several times, until the surface of the molten silver is clean and bright, showing only the pure metal with its characteristic silvery white glow. Now the melt is ready. The moneyer signals to his assistant, and together they prepare for the pour. This is a critical moment, requiring coordination and steady nerves, because molten silver is dangerous. A splash of this metal onto skin causes instant, severe burns. A spill onto the stone floor can crack the flagstones from thermal shock. The slightest tremor in the hands that hold the crucible can send a wave of liquid metal sloshing over the rim with catastrophic results. The long tongs are brought forward. These are not delicate jeweler's tools. These are heavy iron implements, forged specifically for handling crucibles, with jaws that curve to cradle the rounded bottom of the pot and arms that extend far enough to keep the handler's body at a safe distance from the heat. The tongs are already warm from sitting near the furnace, and the moneyer wraps the handles with thick cloth to protect his hands from the metal. He positions the tongs carefully, sliding the jaws beneath the crucible and clamping them tight. The crucible is heavy now, laden with perhaps 10 or 12 pounds of molten silver, and he must lift it smoothly, without jerking or sudden movements that might slosh the contents. The lift is executed with practiced ease. The moneyer straightens his legs, using his powerful thigh muscles rather than his back, and the crucible rises from its nest in the coals, suspended in the jaws of the tongs. Molten silver gleams in the clay pot, its surface trembling slightly with the motion but remaining contained. For a moment, the moneyer simply stands there, allowing his arms to adjust to the weight, finding his balance, making sure his grip on the tong handles is secure. Then, slowly, he begins to walk. The ingot molds are arranged on a long iron table several paces from the furnace. These molds are simple structures, just long, narrow channels carved into blocks of iron, but they are precisely dimensioned to produce rods of silver with a specific cross-section. Each channel is about 18 inches long, half an inch wide, and perhaps a quarter-inch deep, and when molten silver is poured into one of these channels, it will cool into a long, thin rod that is the perfect starting point for making coin blanks. The molds have been preheated by placing them near the furnace, because cold iron would cause the molten silver to solidify too quickly, potentially creating voids or stress fractures in the finished rods. The moneyer approaches the mold table with slow, deliberate steps. His assistant has moved ahead to prepare the molds, using a brush made from horsehair to coat the interior of each channel with a thin layer of powdered graphite. The graphite acts as a release agent, preventing the silver from bonding to the iron and making it easier to remove the solidified rods once they have cooled. The coating must be thin and even. Too much graphite, and the surface of the silver rod will be rough and pitted. Too little, and the metal will stick, requiring forceful extraction that might damage either the rod or the mold. Now comes the pour. The moneyer tilts the crucible slowly, watching as the bright pool of molten metal inside begins to shift toward the rim. The movement must be controlled, gradual, giving the metal time to flow smoothly without surging. As the crucible reaches the critical angle, molten silver begins to spill from the rim in a glowing stream. It flows with the heavy, viscous quality of mercury, catching the light and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. The stream arcs through the air for perhaps 6 inches before it contacts the first mold, and when it does, there is an immediate reaction. The hiss is sharp and explosive, a sound like water dropped onto a hot griddle, but much louder, more violent. Steam erupts from the point of contact, not water vapor in this case, but vaporized graphite and other substances driven off by the intense heat of the molten metal. The iron mold, despite being preheated, is still several hundred degrees cooler than the silver, and this temperature differential causes the surface of the molten metal to solidify almost instantly upon contact. But beneath that thin, solid skin, the silver remains liquid, flowing and filling the channel, pushing forward until the mold is full from end to end. The moneyer moves the crucible smoothly along the length of the mold, maintaining a steady pour, and the stream of molten silver follows, filling the channel evenly. When the first mold is full, he shifts slightly and begins filling the second, then the third, working his way down the table with practiced efficiency. The hissing continues, a steady background noise punctuated by occasional pops and cracks as the cooling metal contracts and settles. Clouds of steam and smoke rise from the molds, carrying with them the sharp smell of hot iron and the faint, almost sweet scent of molten silver, a smell that is hard to describe, but instantly recognizable to anyone who has spent time in a metalworking shop. As each mold fills, the bright liquid surface of the silver gradually dulls as a skin of solidified metal forms on top. This skin is at first very thin, almost transparent, showing the glowing liquid beneath, but it thickens rapidly as the metal gives up its heat to the iron mold. Within seconds, the surface has turned from bright orange to dark red, and within a minute it has faded to a dull grey, though if you were to look closely you would still see a faint cherry-red glow visible around the edges where the metal contacts the mold walls. The interior of the rod remains molten for several minutes more, cooling slowly from the outside in, and during this time the metal undergoes internal changes, its crystalline structure forming and aligning, grain boundaries developing as the liquid transforms into solid. When all the molds are full, the munnier carefully sets the crucible back down near the furnace, placing it on an iron stand where it can cool safely. The empty crucible still radiates significant heat, and it will take at least an hour before it can be handled without tongs. The interior surface, now exposed to view, is coated with a thin glaze where the molten silver has reacted with the clay, and there are small beads of metal clinging to the walls, droplets that did not flow out during the pour. These will be carefully scraped out later and added to the next melt, because again, every fraction of an ounce must be recovered and accounted for. The ingot rods are left to cool in their molds for approximately 15 minutes. This cooling time is critical. If the rods are removed too soon, while the metal is still too hot and soft, they will deform under their own weight or break when handled. If they are left too long, they may contract and grip the mold walls so tightly that extraction becomes difficult. The munnier has learned through experience exactly how long to wait, and he uses this time to prepare for the next stage of the process, gathering his tools and checking his equipment. When the time is right, he returns to the mold table and begins the extraction. Using a pair of short tongs, he grips the end of the first rod and pulls gently. The rod slides out of the channel with a faint metallic scraping sound, revealing a long, thin bar of silver that is still warm to the touch, but solid enough to handle. The surface of the rod has a slightly rough texture from the graphite coating, and its color is the familiar gray of unpolished silver. But when the rod is turned in the light, there is a hint of brightness showing through, a promise of the metal's true appearance once it has been worked and finished. Each rod is inspected visually as it is removed from the mold. The munnier checks for obvious defects, cracks or voids, or surface irregularities that might cause problems later in the process. Most rods emerge clean and sound, but occasionally there is one with a flaw, perhaps a small void where an air bubble was trapped during the pour, or a crack along its length from uneven cooling. These defective rods are set aside to be remelted. They cannot be used for coinage, because any weakness in the starting material will only be amplified during the subsequent hammering and striking processes. The good rods are stacked carefully on a wooden rack where they will finish cooling completely before being moved to the next stage. As they cool, they continue to contract slightly, and sometimes you can hear them making faint ticking sounds, tiny pings and clicks as internal stresses relieve themselves. The rack fills with rods, neat rows of grey metal bars, each one representing several ounces of silver that will soon be transformed into hundreds of individual coins. Now the hammering begins. This is perhaps the most physically demanding part of the entire minting process, requiring strength, endurance, and precision. The goal is to take each round rod and flatten it into a thin sheet, reducing its thickness from about a quarter inch to something closer to the thickness of a modern credit card, thin enough that when circular blanks are cut from it, they will have the proper weight and feel for a penny or a halfpenny or whatever denomination is being produced. The anvil stands at the center of the hammering station, a massive block of iron weighing perhaps 300 pounds, mounted on a thick wooden stump that has been sunk deep into the stone floor. The face of the anvil is flat and smooth, polished to a mirror finish by thousands of hours of use, and it is this polished surface that will impart its smoothness to the silver sheet. Any roughness or imperfection in the anvil face would be transferred to the metal being worked, so maintaining the anvil in perfect condition is a constant priority. At the end of each day, the anvil face is carefully cleaned and oiled to prevent rust, and periodically it is resurfaced by a specialist who uses grinding stones and polishing compounds to restore the mirror finish. The hammers themselves are specialized tools, heavier than a carpenter's hammer, but lighter than a blacksmith's sledge. Each hammer weighs perhaps 4 or 5 pounds, enough to deliver significant force with each blow, but not so heavy that it cannot be swung repeatedly for hours at a time. The head is made from hardened steel, with a flat face that is kept perfectly smooth and clean. The handle is ash wood, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand, and it is replaced regularly because the constant vibration of striking metal gradually loosens the wood fibers and weakens the handle. The moneyer selects a cooled rod from the rack and carries it to the anvil. He places it on the anvil face, positioning it lengthwise, and then he raises the hammer. The first blow falls with a sharp, ringing clang, a sound that echoes through the workshop and seems to hang in the air for a moment before fading. The rod deforms under the impact, flattening slightly where the hammer struck, and the moneyer moves the rod fractionally and strikes again. Clang, move, clang, move, clang. A rhythm develops, steady and hypnotic, the regular percussion of hammer on silver on iron, creating a pattern of sound that becomes the dominant element in the workshop's soundscape. The rod gradually flattens and widens. What started as a round bar about half an inch in diameter slowly transforms into a ribbon of metal, perhaps an inch wide, then 2 inches, then 3. The moneyer works his way along the length of the rod, striking overlapping blows, ensuring that every part of the metal receives equal treatment. The silver is surprisingly malleable. Unlike iron or steel, which would work harden and become brittle under this kind of treatment, silver remains soft and ductile, allowing itself to be shaped and stretched without cracking or breaking. This is one of the properties that makes silver ideal for coinage. It can be worked cold, without the need for repeated reheating, and it can be struck with dies hard enough to leave sharp, clear impressions without shattering the metal. But the hammering still creates heat. Each impact of the hammer compresses the crystalline structure of the metal, and the energy of that compression is converted into thermal energy. After a few minutes of steady hammering, the silver feels warm to the touch, warmer than body temperature, and the moneyer must be careful not to let it get too hot, because excessive heat would begin to anneal the metal, making it too soft and potentially causing it to tear when handled. The work is rhythmic, but requires constant attention. The moneyer must judge the force of each blow, hitting hard enough to deform the metal effectively, but not so hard that he creates ripples or waves in the surface. He must keep the silver moving on the anvil, rotating it slightly after each strike so that the hammering is evenly distributed and the sheet grows uniformly in all directions. He must watch for signs of work hardening, subtle changes in the way the metal responds to the hammer that indicate it is becoming stressed and might need annealing. And he must maintain the rhythm, that steady clang-clang-clang that measures out the hours and marks the progress of the work. An apprentice stands nearby, watching the process with intense focus. He is learning the craft, absorbing the knowledge that cannot be taught through words alone, but must be acquired through observation and practice. He watches the angle of the hammer as it falls, noting how the moneyer holds the handle not at the very end, but slightly forward, gaining better control at the expense of some leverage. He watches how the rod is repositioned after each blow, rotated and shifted so that the hammering pattern covers the entire surface without leaving gaps. He watches the way the experienced craftsman's muscles move, the rhythm of shoulders and arms, and wrists working in coordination to deliver blow after blow without apparent effort. And he knows that achieving this same economy of motion will require years of practice. The sheet grows thinner. What was once a quarter-inch thick is now perhaps an eighth of an inch. The moneyer pauses to check his progress, running his fingers over the surface, feeling for variations in thickness. His hands are sensitive instruments, capable of detecting differences too small to see, and he makes mental notes about which areas need more work. Then the hammering resumes. Clang, clang, clang. The sound is almost meditative in its regularity, a metronome of metal that marks the passage of time in this underground workshop. Eventually, the sheet reaches the desired thickness. The moneyer holds it up to the light, checking its uniformity, and satisfied with his work, he sets it aside on a clean section of the work table. The sheet is perhaps 18 inches long and 6 inches wide, a ribbon of grey metal that still shows the subtle texture of the hammer marks on its surface. This texture will be smoothed out in later stages, but for now it serves as evidence of the handcrafting that has gone into producing this material. Process repeats with the next rod, and the next, and the next. The stack of finished sheets grows slowly as the hours pass. This is not fast work. A skilled moneyer might process 10 or 12 rods in a full day's work, producing perhaps 15 or 20 pounds of sheet silver ready for the next stage. But quantity is less important than quality. Every sheet must meet the standard for thickness and uniformity, because these sheets will be cut into blanks that must all weigh exactly the same. Variation in thickness means variation in weight, and variation in weight means that some coins will contain more silver than they should while others contain less. And this is unacceptable in a system where the currency's value is directly tied to its metal content. When a sufficient quantity of sheet silver has been accumulated, the work moves to the next station, where the cutting takes place. The shears used for this work are substantial tools, similar in appearance to large scissors, but much heavier and stronger. The blades are made from high-carbon steel, hardened and sharpened to maintain a clean cutting edge, and they are mounted on long handles that provide leverage for cutting through metal. Each blade is perhaps 8 inches long, and the handles extend another foot beyond the pivot point, giving the operator enough mechanical advantage to shear through silver with relative ease. The cutting station is set up near a window where natural light supplements the lamps and firelight, because this work requires good visibility. The moneyer who specializes in this task sits on a low bench, the shears in his lap, and he draws a sheet of silver toward him. The sheet is placed on a wooden cutting board that is marked with guidelines, faint lines scribed into the wood that help ensure the cuts are made at consistent intervals. The goal is to cut the sheet into rough circles that are approximately the same diameter as the finished coin will be. But precision is not critical at this stage, because the blanks will be further refined later. The shears are positioned at the edge of the sheet, the blades aligned to make the first cut. The moneyer squeezes the handles together, and the blades slide past each other with a sharp snip-snap sound, parting the metal cleanly. The silver is soft enough that it does not offer much resistance, and the cut edge is smooth, free from the burrs or tears that would result from cutting harder metals. A narrow strip is separated from the main sheet, and this strip is then cross-cut into individual segments, each one roughly square. These rough squares are then rounded. The moneyer holds each square piece between his thumb and forefinger and uses the shears to nibble away at the corners, snip, snap, gradually transforming the square into a circle. The work requires judgment and a steady hand. Cut too much and the blank will be underweight. Cut too little and the corners remain, creating an irregularly shaped coin. The moneyer aims for a circle that is just slightly larger than the final coin diameter, leaving material that can be trimmed or filed, if necessary, during the final finishing stages. The sound of the shears becomes its own rhythm, distinct from the clang of hammering but equally hypnotic. Snip, pause, snip, pause, snip. Each cut removes a small fragment of silver, and these fragments fall into a collection tray positioned beneath the cutting board. Nothing is wasted. Even these tiny scraps will be gathered up at the end of the day, weighed, and eventually remelted. The pile of rough circular blanks grows, each one a dull grey disk about the size of a small button, weighing perhaps a penny's weight, ready for the final transformation that will turn it into actual currency. The metal is remarkably pliable at this stage. If you were to pick up one of these blanks and flex it between your fingers, you would find that it bends easily, almost like a thin piece of leather. This softness is intentional. The silver must be soft enough to accept the impression of the dies when it is struck, allowing the detailed images of the king's portrait and the surrounding inscriptions to be pressed deep into the metal surface. But this same softness also means the blanks must be handled carefully. Drop one on the floor and it might dent. Stack them carelessly and they might bend or crease. Each blank represents value, and damaged blanks must be rejected and remelted, which represents lost productivity and wasted effort. As the day progresses, the workshop settles into its rhythms. The furnaces continue to roar, fed regularly with fresh charcoal by the apprentices who monitor their temperature and make adjustments to the bellows. The hammers continue to ring against the anvils, sometimes in synchrony as multiple moneyers work side by side, sometimes in counterpoint, creating complex percussion patterns. The shears continue their snip-snap cutting, producing more and more blanks. And underlying it all is the constant heat, the smoke, the smell of hot metal and charcoal and sweat, the physical reality of a place where wealth is quite literally forged from raw materials through the application of skill and labor. The workers themselves are a particular breed. This is not gentleman's work. This is hot, difficult, demanding physical labor that requires strength and endurance and tolerance for uncomfortable conditions. The men who work here are craftsmen, yes, trained in specialized skills that took years to acquire, but they are also laborers, earning their daily bread through sweat and muscle. Their hands are scarred from small burns and cuts, their faces are weathered from constant exposure to heat and smoke, and their backs carry the accumulated stress of thousands of hours bent over anvils and workbenches. But they take pride in their work. These men know that they are producing the currency of the realm, that the coins they make will circulate throughout the kingdom, changing hands in markets and taverns and manor houses, facilitating commerce and enabling the kingdom's economy to function. Every penny they produce carries a tiny part of their labor out into the world. The master of the mint makes his rounds throughout the day, observing the work, checking quality, making sure the ledgers are being properly maintained. He is ultimately responsible for everything that happens here, answerable directly to the king's treasurer for any discrepancies or failures. His position is one of trust and authority, but also of significant risk, because the penalties for mismanagement or dishonesty in this role are severe. He must ensure that the silver that enters this workshop is accounted for at every stage, that the weight of the finished coins matches the weight of the raw bullion, that none of the precious metal is diverted or stolen. He must also ensure quality, that the coins meet the established standards for weight and purity and appearance. A mint that produces inferior coinage damages the kingdom's reputation and undermines confidence in the currency, and this cannot be tolerated. As the afternoon wears on, the pile of rough blanks continues to grow. These blanks are still far from finished coins. They will need to be further refined, trimmed to exact weight, polished, and finally struck with the dies that will imprint them with the images and inscriptions that transform them from mere pieces of metal into official currency. But that work will come later, perhaps tomorrow, or the day after. For now, the focus is on production, on transforming the heavy bars of raw silver that arrived this morning into workable material. The light filtering through the high windows begins to take on the golden quality of late afternoon, and the master signals that it is time to begin the shutdown process for the day. The furnaces will not be completely extinguished, because that would waste fuel and time tomorrow when they would need to be relit and brought back up to temperature. Instead, they will be banked, the airflow reduced so the fires burn low and slow through the night, maintaining just enough heat to keep the fire bricks warm. The tools are cleaned and put away. The work surfaces are swept clean of metal fragments and dust. The partially finished work is carefully stored in locked cabinets, and the day's production is tallied, with the master personally weighing the stack of blanks and comparing the total weight to the amount of bullion that was melted, checking that the numbers match within acceptable tolerances. This is the world of the medieval mint, a place where metal and fire and human skill combine to create one of the most fundamental tools of civilization. Every coin that emerges from this workshop is a small miracle of craftsmanship, a precisely weighted and carefully crafted object that embodies value and enables commerce. And as you drift toward sleep tonight, you can imagine the rhythm of the hammers, the hiss of molten metal meeting cold molds, the warmth of the furnaces, and the steady, patient work of transforming raw silver into the currency of a kingdom. The work continues, day after day, year after year, an endless cycle of melting and pouring and hammering and cutting, producing the coins that will pass through countless hands and enable the transactions that bind a society together. Rest now and let the sounds of the mint fade into dreams of glowing metal and ringing anvils, knowing that somewhere in the depths of history, this work continues, timeless and essential. The blanks rest in shallow wooden trays, stacked carefully so they do not bend or mar each other's surfaces. There are hundreds of them now, the result of yesterday's labor, each one a rough circle of silver about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and perhaps the thickness of 2 sheets of parchment pressed together. They catch the morning light filtering through the high windows, reflecting it back in dull, muted flashes that hint at the brightness locked within the metal, waiting to be revealed through the final stages of work. These are not coins yet. They are potential. They are promise. They are blank canvases waiting for the image that will transform them from mere pieces of metal into instruments of commerce, tokens of royal authority, physical embodiments of value that will circulate through the kingdom for years or even decades to come. If you were to pick up one of these blanks and examine it closely, you would see that it is not quite perfectly circular. The edges show the irregular marks left by the shears, small indentations where the blades bit into the metal, slight variations in the curve where the cutting was not absolutely precise. The surfaces are relatively smooth but not polished, showing a faint texture from the hammering process that created the sheet from which they were cut. There is no design, no inscription, no image. Just plain silver, gray and unremarkable, waiting. The weight is carefully controlled, each blank having been trimmed to match the standard established by royal decree. But beyond that standardization of mass, these blanks are anonymous, interchangeable, without identity. The transformation that will give them that identity happens at the striking station, and it is here that the true magic of the mint reveals itself. This is where blank metal becomes currency. This is where royal authority is quite literally stamped into silver. This is where the abstraction of monetary value takes physical form. And it all depends on 2 small pieces of steel, carved with extraordinary precision, that will press their images into the soft silver with such force that the metal has no choice but to yield and accept the impression. These pieces of steel are called dies, and they are among the most valuable objects in the entire workshop. Each die represents weeks or even months of painstaking labor by a master engraver, a specialist whose skills are so rare and so critical that he commands wages far higher than even the most experienced moneyer. The engraver works with tiny chisels and gravers, cutting into the face of a steel cylinder, perhaps 2 inches in diameter and 3 inches tall, carving in reverse the image that will appear on the coin. Every line must be perfect. Every letter must be precisely formed. Every detail of the king's portrait must capture not just a likeness, but an impression of authority and legitimacy. The work is done under magnification, using lenses ground from rock crystal, and it requires not just technical skill, but artistic sensibility, an understanding of how light and shadow will interact with the raised and recessed areas of the struck coin to create a readable, attractive image. The die that forms the obverse of the coin, the face that will show the king's portrait, is called the pile. It is mounted in a massive wooden block that sits on the floor of the striking station, positioned so that its engraved face points upward. The block itself is oak, chosen for its density and resistance to splitting, and it has been aged for several years before use to ensure it is completely dry and stable. The die is set into a depression carved into the top of the block, held firmly in place by an iron collar that is hammered tight around its base. This mounting must be absolutely rigid, because any movement of the die during striking will result in doubled images or blurred impressions on the finished coins. The pile sits there, immovable, its engraved face waiting to receive the blank silver discs that will be pressed against it. The die that forms the reverse of the coin, typically showing a cross or other symbol along with inscriptions, is called the trussel. Unlike the pile, the trussel is not fixed in place. It is a handheld tool, a steel cylinder similar in size to the pile, but designed to be gripped and positioned by the striker. The trussel fits into an iron holder that allows it to be aligned precisely over the blank while still being easy to remove and replace when necessary. The top of the trussel, the end opposite the engraved face, is flat and smooth, designed to receive the blow of the hammer without damage. This striking surface has been carefully hardened through heating and quenching, making it tough enough to withstand thousands of impacts without deforming or cracking. The striker himself is a specialist, a craftsman whose entire role in the mint is to perform this one critical operation. He is a large man, broad across the shoulders and thick through the chest and arms, because the work requires not just strength, but sustained power, the ability to deliver forceful, accurate hammer blows repeatedly throughout the day without loss of precision or energy. His hands are enormous, scarred and calloused from years of gripping hammers and dies, and his forearms show the kind of muscular development that comes only from performing the same motion thousands upon thousands of times. He stands at the striking station with the solid, rooted stance of someone who has learned through long experience exactly how to position his body for maximum efficiency and minimum fatigue. The hammer he uses is unlike any other in the workshop. It is larger than the hammers used for flattening the silver sheets, with a head that weighs perhaps 8 or 10 pounds, made from dense iron that has been forged and shaped to provide a broad, flat striking surface. The handle is thick ash wood, smooth from handling, and it extends perhaps 18 inches from the head, giving enough leverage to generate tremendous force without requiring an unwieldy swing. The balance point of the hammer has been carefully tuned, adjusted by the striker himself through subtle modifications to the handle length and the way the head is mounted, until the tool feels like an extension of his own body, responsive and natural in his grip. The process begins simply. An apprentice stands nearby with one of the wooden trays full of blanks. He selects a blank, picks it up carefully between thumb and forefinger, and places it precisely on the face of the pile die. The blank must be centered, sitting flat against the engraved surface, because any tilt or misalignment will result in an off-center strike that produces a coin with the design positioned incorrectly. The apprentice has developed an eye for this placement, and he can position the blank accurately without conscious thought, his fingers releasing it at exactly the right moment so it settles into position without sliding or shifting. The striker reaches for the trussel, which rests on a small wooden stand within easy reach. He lifts it, feeling its familiar weight, and positions it carefully over the blank, lowering it until the engraved face of the trussel contacts the upper surface of the silver disc. The trussel must be held perfectly vertical, perpendicular to the face of the pile below, because any angle will cause uneven pressure during the strike and result in a poorly formed image. The striker's left hand grips the trussel firmly, his fingers wrapped around the iron holder, his wrist locked to prevent any rotation or tilt. His right hand raises the hammer. There is a moment of stillness, a brief pause where everything is aligned and ready. The blank sits between the two dies, waiting. The striker's muscles tense, gathering energy. And then the hammer falls. It is not a wild swing or a desperate blow. It is controlled, precise, the product of thousands of hours of practice. The hammer descends in a smooth arc, accelerating as it falls, and it strikes the top of the trussel with a sound that is less a clang and more a solid thud, a deep, resonant impact that you feel as much as hear. The force is tremendous. In the fraction of a second that the hammer is in contact with the trussel, something like a ton of pressure is transmitted through the steel die to the soft silver blank beneath. The silver, caught between the two hardened steel surfaces and subjected to this immense compressive force, has no choice but to flow. Its crystalline structure deforms, the metal spreading outward from the center of the impact, pressing into every tiny crevice and line of the engraved designs on both dies. The king's portrait, carved in reverse into the pile, presses upward into the bottom of the blank. The cross and inscriptions, carved in reverse into the trussel, press downward into the top. The silver conforms, accepts, yields, and in that brief moment of pressure, the transformation occurs. When the striker lifts the trussel away, pulling it smoothly upward and setting it aside, what remains on the face of the pile is no longer a blank. It is a coin. The dull grey disc has become bright where the pressure has polished the surface, and the relief of the engraved image stands proud, catching the light. The king's portrait is there, sharp and clear, showing his face in profile, his crown detailed with tiny points and jewels, his beard and hair rendered in flowing lines that suggest texture and volume. Around the portrait runs a circle of text, Latin words in abbreviated form declaring his name and titles. On the reverse, visible when the coin is flipped, the cross divides the surface into quarters, and more inscriptions name the mint and the moneyer responsible for this particular coin. The striker reaches down and plucks the finished coin from the die face, his fingers pinching its edge, and he tosses it into a large wooden bowl that sits on a table beside the striking station. The coin tumbles through the air, glinting, and lands, among others, already in the bowl with a bright metallic clink, a sound that is instantly recognizable, the sound of coined money, of wealth made tangible. Without pausing, the striker returns his attention to the pile die, where the apprentice has already placed another blank, ready for the next strike. The rhythm establishes itself quickly. Place, strike, toss, place, strike, toss. The striker's movements become fluid, automatic, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. His left hand positions the trussel, his right hand swings the hammer, the thud of impact echoes through the workshop. The trussel is lifted, the coin is tossed aside, and already the next blank is in position. The hammer rises and falls with metronomic regularity, perhaps once every 3 or 4 seconds, and the pile of finished coins in the wooden bowl grows steadily, each addition producing that distinctive clink as silver strikes silver. This is skilled work, but it is also deeply physical, demanding work. Each swing of the hammer requires full commitment, full force, because anything less will result in a weak strike that fails to press the design fully into the silver. A weak strike produces a coin where the image is shallow and indistinct, where the letters are barely readable, where the king's features are blurred and uncertain. Such coins are unacceptable. They must be consigned to the reject pile, to be melted down and struck again, which represents wasted time and effort. So the striker must maintain his power and precision throughout the entire shift, delivering strong, accurate blows hundreds of times, thousands of times, until his arms burn with fatigue and his shoulders ache from the repetitive motion. But there is a satisfaction in the work too, a sense of accomplishment that comes from seeing the pile of finished coins accumulate. Each coin is a small victory, a successful completion of the transformation process. Each coin represents value created, wealth made real. And there is something almost meditative about the rhythm, the way the repetitive action allows the mind to drift while the body continues its practiced movements. The striker enters a state of flow, where time seems to compress, where hours pass in what feels like minutes, marked only by the steady accumulation of coins and the gradual shifting of the light through the windows as the sun tracks across the sky. The workshop fills with the sound of striking. If there are multiple strikers working simultaneously, which is often the case when large orders must be filled quickly, the thuds of their hammers create a complex percussion pattern, sometimes synchronizing briefly before drifting apart into counterpoint, sometimes overlapping in ways that produce interesting acoustic effects as the sound waves interact. And underneath the hammering is the constant background clink, clink, clink of coins being tossed into collection bowls, a sound that serves as an audible measure of productivity, a counter ticking off the units of completed work. The dies themselves gradually wear from the constant striking. Each impact, each moment of tremendous pressure as the silver flows against the hardened steel, erodes the fine details of the engraving just slightly. The wear is imperceptible from strike to strike, invisible from coin to coin, but over hundreds or thousands of strikes, it accumulates. The sharpest points of the engraving become slightly rounded. The deepest cuts become slightly shallower. The dies that produced crisp, razor-sharp images when they were new eventually produce coins where the details are softer, less distinct, still acceptable but noticeably different from the early strikes. This die wear is expected and accounted for in the mint's operations. Each die has a working life measured in the thousands of coins, and when a die becomes too worn to produce acceptable quality, it is retired, and a new die is commissioned from the engraver. The used dies are not discarded carelessly. They represent royal authority, bearing the king's image and name, and they cannot be allowed to fall into the wrong hands where they might be used for counterfeiting or other fraudulent purposes. Instead, worn dies are defaced, their engraved surfaces ground away or hammered to obliterate the images, and then they are melted down, the steel reclaimed and used for other purposes. The destruction of dies is carried out under supervision, witnessed, and recorded in the ledgers, because even a worn die could potentially be used to produce passable forgeries if it were stolen. As the morning progresses and moves into afternoon, the wooden bowl at the striking station fills with coins. When it becomes too full, threatening to overflow, the apprentice brings a fresh bowl and carries the filled one to the next station, where the coins will undergo inspection and counting. The weight of a full bowl is substantial, perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of silver, representing hundreds of individual coins, and the apprentice must grip it firmly with both hands to transport it safely across the workshop floor. The inspection station is staffed by specialists whose job is quality control. These are men with sharp eyes and sensitive fingers, trained to detect the subtle flaws that might escape casual notice. Each coin is examined individually, first visually and then by feel. The inspector holds the coin up to the light, tilting it to catch the reflection, checking that the design is complete and properly centered. He runs his thumb over the surface, feeling the relief of the engraving, making sure the impression is deep and crisp. He checks the edge, looking for cracks or splits that might indicate the blank was defective. He verifies that the coin is round, not oval or irregular from a misaligned strike. Most coins pass inspection without issue, having been struck properly from good blanks using sound dies. These are tossed into the acceptance pile, adding to the growing mountain of approved currency. But some coins reveal problems. Perhaps the blank was not quite centered on the pile, resulting in an off-center strike where part of the design is missing, cut off by the edge of the coin. Perhaps there was a tiny fragment of debris on one of the dies, creating a raised bump or an indentation in the finished coin. Perhaps the blank itself had a flaw, a void or inclusion that became visible only after striking. These defective coins are set aside in a separate pile to be returned to the melting pot and processed again. The rejected coins represent lost productivity, but they are an inevitable part of the process. No matter how careful the workers are, no matter how precise their techniques, there will always be some percentage of failures. The medieval mint operates under demanding quality standards because the currency must be trusted, and trust requires consistency. Every penny must look like every other penny. Every shilling must weigh what a shilling should weigh. Variation undermines confidence, and confidence is the foundation of a functioning monetary system. So the rejected coins are accepted as a necessary cost, and the workers simply continue their efforts to minimize the rejection rate through skill and attention to detail. The approved coins accumulate in large wooden bins, each bin capable of holding thousands of coins. The bins are positioned on sturdy tables, arranged in rows, and as they fill, they begin to represent significant amounts of wealth. A bin containing 5,000 pennies holds over 20 pounds of silver, enough to purchase a good horse or pay a skilled craftsman's wages for several months. The sight of multiple bins full of shining silver coins is impressive, even to the workers who see it daily, because it makes visible the abstract concept of money, transforming it from numbers in a ledger to tangible, touchable, countable reality. Late in the afternoon, when the day's production target has been met, the work shifts from creation to accounting. This is perhaps the most critical phase of the entire operation, because every coin must be counted, every ounce of silver must be accounted for, and the final tally must match the amount of bullion that was originally consigned to the mint for processing. The king's treasury does not operate on trust or estimates. It demands exact accounting, verifiable numbers, documentation that can be audited and confirmed. The counting is performed by specialists, men who have trained for years to develop the speed and accuracy required for handling large quantities of coins. They work at long tables, using methods that have been refined over generations to maximize efficiency while minimizing errors. The basic technique involves creating stacks of coins in standardized quantities. A counter picks up coins from the unsorted pile, stacking them in towers of exactly 20 coins each. The rhythm of this work is distinctive, a rapid tap-tap-tap-tap as each coin is placed precisely atop the previous one, building the stack with practiced speed. When a stack reaches 20 coins, it is pushed aside and a new stack is begun. The stacks themselves become counting units. 5 stacks of 20 coins is 100 coins. 10 stacks is 200. The counters arrange these stacks in geometric patterns on the table, making it easy to see at a glance how many coins have been processed. A complete table might hold 50 stacks, representing 1,000 coins, and when that number is reached, the coins are swept into a leather bag, and the table is cleared to begin counting the next 1,000. The sound of this counting process is remarkable. The constant tap-tap-tap of coins being stacked is punctuated by the periodic whoosh-clink of completed stacks being pushed aside, and underneath it all is the gentler rustle-clink of hands sorting through the unsorted pile, selecting coins and bringing them forward to be stacked. When multiple counters are working simultaneously, the sounds overlap and interweave, creating a complex audio texture that is uniquely characteristic of a busy mint. Close your eyes in this workshop during counting time. and you would know immediately where you were, just from the distinctive percussion of silver on silver. The counters work with impressive speed, their hands moving in blurs of practiced motion, but speed must not come at the expense of accuracy. Each counter knows that his work will be verified, that the bags he fills will be weighed and checked, and that errors will be noticed and attributed to him personally. The pressure to perform both quickly and accurately is constant, and it requires intense concentration. The counters develop a kind of focused trance state, their attention narrowed to the immediate task, their awareness limited to the coins passing through their fingers and the stacks growing on the table before them. They work in silence or near silence, because conversation would disrupt the mental counting that accompanies the physical stacking, the internal voice that tracks the accumulation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 15, 16, 17, and 20. Stack complete, begin again. As each 1,000 coin quantity is completed and bagged, the bag is set aside and marked with chalk, a simple tally mark that indicates its contents. The bags themselves are substantial, made from heavy leather that can withstand the weight and the abrasion of the coins within. When a bag contains 1,000 silver pennies, it weighs perhaps 5 or 6 pounds, heavy enough that carrying multiple bags requires significant strength. The leather is thick and somewhat stiff, treated with oils to make it resistant to moisture and decay, and it is sewn with strong linen thread using a specialized saddle stitch that distributes stress evenly and prevents the seams from splitting under load. The filled bags accumulate on a separate table, arranged in neat rows, each one representing a precisely counted quantity of finished currency. As the rows grow longer, the visual representation of the day's productivity becomes clear. 10 bags is 10,000 pennies. 20 bags is 20,000. The numbers are staggering when you consider that each individual coin was hand-struck, one at a time, through the physical effort of the striker and his hammer. 20,000 coins represents thousands of hammer blows, thousands of moments of transformation, thousands of repetitions of the same precise process. But the counting is not finished when the initial stacks and bags are completed. There must be verification. A second counter, working independently, recounts a sample of bags to confirm accuracy. He opens a randomly selected bag, pours its contents onto a counting table, and performs his own count, creating fresh stacks and tallying the total. If his count matches the mark on the bag is resealed and marked as verified. If there is a discrepancy, both the original counter and the verifier must recount together until the error is identified and resolved. This double-checking system catches mistakes before they can propagate through the Treasury records, ensuring that the final tallies are reliable. Finally, the verified bags are weighed. The master of the mint supervises this personally, using the same bronze scale that was employed to weigh the original bullion. Empty bags are weighed first to determine their tare weight, and then filled bags are weighed, and the difference represents the weight of the coins within. This weight should match a calculated value based on the count and the standard weight of each coin. If a bag marked as containing 1,000 pennies weighs significantly more or less than 1,000 pennies should weigh, there is a problem that must be investigated. Perhaps the count was incorrect. Perhaps some of the blanks were not properly trimmed to weight. Perhaps, in the worst case, there has been deliberate fraud, with someone substituting lighter coins or removing silver from the mint. The weighing is therefore not merely a formality, but a critical control measure, and it is performed with solemn attention to detail. The master reads the weights aloud, and a scribe records them in the ledger alongside the counts. The numbers are cross-referenced, compared to the original bullion weights, checked for consistency with the expected yields and acceptable wastage levels. Mathematics is employed. Calculations performed to verify that the amount of silver that entered the process matches the amount of silver leaving it, accounting for the small losses to dross and filing and other unavoidable waste. When the final bag has been counted and weighed and verified, when the last entry has been made in the ledger, and the numbers have been checked and rechecked, the master of the mint signs the day's production record with his own hand, adding his personal seal to certify that the work has been performed according to standard and that the accounting is accurate. This signed record will be delivered to the King's Treasury, where it will become part of the official financial archive, a permanent documentation of the Mint's operations on this particular day. The filled and sealed bags are loaded into the iron-bound chests that will transport them to the Treasury. This loading is performed carefully, with the bags arranged in layers to distribute weight evenly and prevent the lower bags from being crushed. When a chest is full, its lid is closed and locked with heavy iron padlocks, and the keys are handed to the guards who will escort the chest to its final destination. The transfer of the keys is witnessed and recorded, establishing a clear chain of custody that ensures accountability. The guards sign receipts acknowledging that they have received custody of specific quantities of coins, and these receipts become part of the permanent record. The workshop begins to settle as the day's work concludes. The furnaces, which have been maintained at low temperatures throughout the day to provide heat for melting the occasional batch of rejects or scrap, are now banked completely, the air supply reduced to a minimum so the fires will burn slowly through the night without consuming excessive fuel. The anvils are cleaned, their surfaces wiped down with oiled rags to prevent rust. The hammers and shears and other tools are inspected for damage or wear, and anything requiring maintenance is set aside for the attention of the tool keeper, who will repair or replace it before tomorrow's work begins. The dies are removed from their mountings and stored in a locked cabinet, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect the engraved surfaces from moisture and corrosion. The cabinet is secured with multiple locks, and the keys are held by the master personally because the security of the dies is paramount. Without the dies, coins cannot be struck. With the dies in unauthorized hands, fraudulent coins could be produced. The dies are therefore treated as precious objects, guarded and protected with the same care given to the silver itself. The floor is swept clean of metal fragments and dust, and these sweepings are not discarded but collected in a special pan and saved for processing. Even the tiny scraps and filings contain silver, and in an operation where every ounce must be accounted for, even these seemingly insignificant bits of metal have value. They will be added to the next melting batch, recovered and recycled, nothing wasted. As the light fades and the workshop grows dim, oil lamps are extinguished one by one, leaving only a few burning near the door where the night guards will maintain their vigil. The day shift workers depart, passing through the heavy oak door and into the corridor beyond, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors as they make their way to the castle quarters, where they will take their evening meal and rest before tomorrow brings the same routine again. But you remain, settling onto a rough wooden bench positioned near one of the cooling furnaces. The heat still radiates from the fire brick, not the intense blast of midday, but a gentle, comforting warmth that takes the chill from the stone-walled workshop. The guards take up their positions, one at the door, one near the cabinet that holds the dies, their faces serious and alert despite the late hour. These men will stand watch through the night, ensuring that no unauthorized person enters, that no one tampers with the equipment or attempts to steal the valuable materials stored here. The silence that descends is not complete. The furnaces make small sounds as they cool, faint ticks and creaks as the metal and brick contract slightly. The building itself settles, old timbers adjusting with groans and whispers. Outside, beyond the thick walls, you might hear the distant sounds of the castle settling into night. Guards calling passwords, dogs barking, the faint music of someone playing a reed pipe in a far-off chamber. But inside the mint, the dominant sensation is one of stillness, of work completed, of transformation achieved. You close your eyes, and in the darkness behind your eyelids, you can still see the bright flash of the hammer striking the trussel, still hear the solid thud of impact, still feel the weight of a newly struck coin cool and smooth in your palm. The day's work has been good. The bullion has been transformed into currency. The king's treasury will be replenished. Commerce will continue. And tomorrow it will all begin again. The endless cycle of melting and pouring and hammering and striking. The patient, skilled work of turning raw metal into the coined money that makes a kingdom function. The warmth from the furnace seeps into your muscles, easing the aches from the day's labor. Your breathing slows, deepens, becomes rhythmic and steady. The sounds of the workshop fade to a gentle background hum, a lullaby of cooling metal and settling stone. And gradually, peacefully, you drift towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that the wealth is counted and sealed, that the guards are watchful, that everything is in its proper place. And as the silver cools and the treasury fills with the weight of the kingdom, the work is done. The coins are counted, and you are safe. Sleep well.